the first song we ever wrote together.
And we'll all go together. The heat is on the street.
Glenn Frey had a gift for making the monumental feel intimate. Whether he was crafting the sun-soaked harmonies of the Eagles or giving voice to the quiet drama of the characters in his songs, his artistry was all about connection. So when he shared his 6 favorite albums, it wasn't just a catalogue of musical masterpieces. It was an insight into the inner workings of a man who shaped one of the most iconic sounds of the 20th century. Frey's choices weren't arbitrary or designed to impress. They were personal, full of the influences that guided him as a musician, a storyteller, and a lover of the craft. What makes Frey's list so fascinating is how it weaves together both the aspirational and the deeply grounded. These aren't merely records he admired from afar, they're albums that taught him lessons, shaped his worldview, and stirred something in his soul. From the symphonic splendor of Pet Sounds to the raw energy of Otis Redding's live performances, Frey's choices reveal an artist who was both a student and a fan. It's a collection that reflects not only his respect for musical innovation, but also his yearning for emotional authenticity, a blend that ultimately defined his career. The first entry on Frey's list, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, is so universally adored it's practically a cliché to love it, but isn't that the point?
Wouldn't it be nice if we were older, then we wouldn't have to wait so long?
Frey didn't feel the need to hedge his bets here. He loved it for the same reasons so many other songwriters do, because it's genius. It's so sophisticated, he said, with the kind of awe that never really left him, even decades after the album's release. I was overwhelmed. Caroline No and God Only Knows are my favourites. It's worth pausing on this because when someone like Frey, who wrote some of the most airtight melodies of the 20th century, is talking about being overwhelmed, you listen. This wasn't just a record he admired, it was a record that rewired the way he thought about songwriting. Brian Wilson's intricate arrangements and almost painfully intimate lyrics gave Frey permission to see pop music as something that could be both ambitious and emotionally devastating at the same time.
Now, this next song is a song that Paul McCartney told me that it was his favorite tune. I may not always love you, but long as there are stars above you.
And yet, for all its lushness and complexity, Pet Sounds is still deeply human. Its beauty lies not in its perfection, but in its vulnerability, its willingness to crack open the heart and let everything spill out. Frey got this. You can hear echoes of Pet Sounds in some of his own work, especially in the way he approached harmony. The Eagles were always meticulous about their vocal arrangements, but there's a certain weightlessness to their best songs, an almost ethereal quality that owes more than a little to Brian Wilson's influence. From the sunny beaches of California, we leap across the pond to London, where Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was busy reinventing everything we thought we knew about what an album could be. Frey's love for the Beatles is well documented, but Sgt. Pepper held a special place in his heart. The first concept album, you hear different things every time you play it, he said, his enthusiasm practically leaping off the page. He wasn't wrong, of course. Even now, more than half a century later, the album still feels fresh, alive with possibilities. Fixing a Hole and Getting Better were 2 tracks he singled out, and it's easy to see why.
It's getting better. It's getting better. Since you've been mine.
Both songs feel like mini manifestos, declarations of intent wrapped in kaleidoscopic production. What's particularly striking about Frey's comments on Sgt. Pepper is the way he frames it as a kind of permission slip. They taught me not to be afraid to write any kind of song, he said, which might sound straightforward at first glance, but is actually a radical statement when you think about it. For a musician in the 1970s, especially one operating within the highly marketable confines of rock music, the idea of writing any kind of song was a bit like declaring yourself a free agent in a league that was still figuring out how to define itself. The Eagles' willingness to dip into country, folk, soul, and even disco owes a lot to this ethos. They weren't afraid to mix and match, to follow their instincts wherever they led, and if the occasional critic bristled at their genre hopping, well, so be it.
Such a fine sight to see. It's a girl, my lord, in a flatbed Ford, slowing down to take a look at me.
It's at this point that the list takes a bit of a turn, where Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper are towering achievements, practically begging for their places in the history books. Linda Ronstadt's What's New is a quieter, more personal choice. Frey's connection to Ronstadt was, of course, deeply rooted. He'd been part of her backing band before the Eagles even existed.
I met them all at the Troubadour Bar, you know. I met Bernie Leadon and, Glenn Frey and Don Henley. I met them at the Troubadour Bar. And they'd just be there. They'd come, they came from Texas and different places, and Bernie came from Florida. And they'd just be needing a gig, and we'd know each other, we'd sing. We used to sing in the corner a lot, in the corner of the bar. Douglas Dillard would be there, and Ronnie Dillard, and we'd do a lot of bluegrass songs. Toward the end of the evening, we'd get singing a lot of white spirituals and stuff like that. The drunker everybody was, the nicer it sounded, And it was fun, and we got to know each other that way, and we got to know each other's music somehow that way, too.
But his admiration for her went far beyond nostalgia. Linda was our muse and a brave artist who followed her instincts, he said, and it's not hard to see what he meant. With What's New, Ronstadt made the bold decision to pivot away from rock and dive headfirst into the world of traditional pop standards.
How glad the many millions of Toms and Dicks and Williams would be.
It was, in many ways, a move that could have backfired spectacularly, but instead, it became one of the defining moments of her career. Frey admired the craftsmanship of the album, the way it brought a contemporary sensibility to these timeless songs without ever losing sight of their emotional core. Songs such as I've Got a Crush on You are perfect, well written, infectious, beautifully sung. There's a simplicity to this comment that feels almost disarming, especially coming from someone who spent so much of his life surrounded by the machinery of the music industry.
I've got a crush on you.
For Frey, it wasn't about chasing trends or reinventing the wheel. It was about connecting with the listener, about finding that spark of humanity in the notes and letting it shine. And then there's Aretha Franklin. To call her inclusion on this list a no-brainer would be an understatement. Frey grew up in Detroit, and Franklin's voice was practically the soundtrack of his youth. I used to hear her sing on her father's gospel radio show, he said, and you can almost hear the boyish nostalgia in his voice.
Oh, this is my moment. My destiny calls me.
Franklin's very best of compilation may not have the conceptual heft of Pet Sounds or Sgt. Pepper, but it doesn't need to. It's a masterclass in vocal brilliance, a showcase of one of the greatest singers of all time at the height of her powers. For Frey, it was more than just an album. It was a touchstone, a reminder of where he came from and what music could do when it was stripped down to its essence.
When I wake up, before I put on my makeup, I say a little prayer for you.
If Franklin represents the soul of this list, then Otis Redding is its beating heart. Frey singled out Redding's Live in Europe for its energy and intensity, and it's not hard to see why. The album is electric.
Accompagné par les meilleurs musiciens d'Amérique, voici Otis Redding. But if you really roll, got to do the thing with shake with all your might there. If you do it right now.
Capturing the kind of raw, unfiltered performance that most artists can only dream of delivering. A great live album that captured the energy of his show, Frey said, before singling out Try a Little Tenderness as a standout track. The way they add instruments and intensity is amazing. It's worth pausing on this, because Frey's comments reveal something essential about the way he approached music. He wasn't just listening to these records for enjoyment, he was studying them, dissecting them, figuring out what made them tick.
Try just a little bit of tenderness.
Finally, we arrive at Music from Big Pink by The Band, an album that feels like the perfect conclusion to this list. Frey described it as funky with a unique pulse and sound, which is about as accurate a description as you're likely to find.
When I saw Carmen and the devil walking side by side.
The record is a study in contrasts, loose but deliberate, rough around the edges but deeply soulful. For Frey, it wasn't just a collection of songs, it was a statement of intent, a reminder that music didn't have to be perfect to be powerful. We played this over and over, he said, and you can almost hear the awe in his voice. What's remarkable about Frey's list isn't just the quality of the albums themselves, but the way they reflect his own musical journey. These records aren't just a who's who of great artists, they're signposts, each one marking a different phase of his life and career. They're reminders of where he came from, what inspired him, and where he hoped to go. Frey's list isn't just a collection of favourites, it's a roadmap, a guide to understanding the man behind the music, and if nothing else, it's a reminder that even the greatest artists never stop being fans. For Glenn Frey, the joy of music wasn't just in creating it, it was in listening, learning, and above all feeling. And in the end, isn't that what it's all about?